I still remember the flashing blue lights, reflecting off the water that night, the kind of light that turns peace into panic. Karen stood at the edge of my driveway, her arms crossed like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the Lake Haven HOA. And in her eyes, my decision to move out, to finally sell my property, was a crime worthy of handcuffs. When the officers stepped out of their cruisers, I didn't argue. I just smiled. Because what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned something far more powerful than any HOA bylaw. I owned the ground beneath all of it. And that night, she was about to find out. When I first bought the property at Lake Haven, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wanted quiet, solitude, a slice of lakefront land to retire on, away from deadlines, office noise, and city traffic. The property was unique. 40 acres that bordered the entire southern edge of the lake. My deed traced back to before the neighborhood even existed, long before the homeowners association formed. My land was part of the original county parcels, untouched and privately zoned. When I built my cabin there, Lake Haven was still a developing community. Over time, streets sprouted, homes multiplied, and one by one, those new residents signed into an HOA that promised order, safety, and community harmony. I stayed cordial but distant. I wasn't part of the HOA, and I made that clear. My land was older, excluded from their charter by law. Still, they sent newsletters to my mailbox, invitations to voluntary meetings, and occasional complaints about things like my non-approved fencing or unregistered boat. Then came Karen. She moved into the neighborhood 3 years after. I did, a sharp-tongued, 50-something woman with short blonde hair, manicured nails, and a clipboard seemingly grafted to her hand. She introduced herself as president of the Lake Haven HOA. The same way some people say, "I'm the sheriff." To her, rules weren't guidelines, they were gospel. And I was the devil she couldn't control. At first, it was small things. Notes on my gate about visual uniformity and community standards. Passive-aggressive comments about my independent mindset. But as months passed, it escalated. Karen didn't like that. I burnt leaves in the fall, perfectly legal on unincorporated land. She didn't like that I parked my old truck by the dock, technically outside HOA jurisdiction. And when I started construction on a new shed, she sent a letter citing unauthorized building activity. I ignored it. That, in her eyes, was my first sin. The HOA board began holding meetings where my name was brought up. Neighbors whispered about that guy down by the water who thinks he's above the rules. Still, I minded my own business. Until one morning, a notice appeared nailed to my fence. All Lake Haven residents must comply with HOA property regulations or face enforcement action. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just meddling. She was preparing for war. Karen's campaign began quietly but spread like wildfire. Within weeks, I was receiving letters from the HOA compliance committee accusing me of non-payment of community fees. Of course, I wasn't a member, but Karen had started including my address in the HOA registry for administrative consistency. When I refused to pay, she doubled the fines. When I ignored them, she sent final notices printed in bold red ink. Then came the harassment. Neighbors I'd once waved to now crossed the street to avoid me. Anonymous complaints arrived at the county zoning office, false claims about code violations, noise complaints, and even environmental concerns about my dock. It was relentless. But what made it worse was how organized it became. Karen leveraged the HOA's petty bureaucracy like a weapon, one paper cut at a time. She scheduled meetings to address community disputes, but never invited me. She sent HOA volunteers to photograph my property for records. And when I confronted her about it, she smirked. If you're living in Lake Haven, you're part of Lake Haven, whether you like it or not. Her arrogance was almost impressive. I consulted my deed, my title documents, and even county GIS maps. Every one of them confirmed it. My land was legally excluded from the HOA boundary. But facts didn't matter to Karen, perception did. Things reached a breaking point when I announced I was moving. I had a buyer interested, a retired couple looking for privacy and quiet. Word got out quickly, and suddenly Karen was at my door again, claiming that I couldn't sell without HOA transfer approval. That was nonsense. I told her politely to leave. The next day, I found a stop work notice taped to my fence, issued not by the county, but by her. That's when I started documenting everything, every letter, every conversation, every neighborly intimidation. I filed quiet inquiries with the county recorder's office and zoning board. The more I dug, the more I realized how deep Karen's reach went, but also how limited her actual authority was. The HOA had been operating under the assumption that the southern properties, including mine, fell under their jurisdiction. They were wrong. The original plats proved that my land and several adjoining lots remained unincorporated county territory, which meant Karen's fines, notices, and demands were legally meaningless. So, I decided to let her play her game. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I went ahead with the sale process. 2 weeks later, as I was loading the last of my belongings into the trailer, the sirens arrived. 2 police cruisers rolled up to my gate. Karen followed behind, clipboard in hand, wearing a smug grin that could cut glass. "Sir," one of the officers said, "we received a call about a property dispute and illegal removal of community property." I almost laughed. Karen had told them I was stealing HOA assets by removing the mailbox cluster that stood on the edge of my land that was, of course, mine. The officers looked uncomfortable. I showed them my deed, the county maps, and a printed statement from the zoning office verifying the property's independence from the HOA. Karen's grin faltered. But I wasn't finished. I handed one of the officers a separate document, a county lease agreement signed 15 years ago. It confirmed that I own the access road leading into Lake Haven itself. When the neighborhood was built, the developer had negotiated temporary easements that expired last year. Karen had spent years enforcing rules on a road she didn't even legally have the right to use. The officer looked from the paper to Karen, then back to me. Her confidence drained instantly. I explained, calmly, that I had already filed a notice of easement termination with the county. Effective that week, the HOA would need a renewed access agreement from me. Karen sputtered, trying to regain control. You can't do that. This is public access." "Ma'am, this is private land. He's within his rights." Silence fell over the lakeside. The sound of water lapping against the shore filled the gap where Karen's authority used to be. For years, she had ruled with forms, threats, and bylaws. But power built on paperwork collapses fast when the paper changes hands. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Justice, when quiet hits harder. Karen turned red, muttered something about calling the HOA attorney, and stormed back to her SUV. She didn't come back that day or any day after. In the weeks that followed, Lake Haven changed. The county reviewed the HOA's jurisdictional maps and issued formal corrections. 3 properties, including mine, were confirmed to lie entirely outside the association's reach. Karen resigned shortly after. The HOA board dissolved. 6 months later, under state investigation for mismanagement of funds, I finalized my sale and moved out peacefully, but not before negotiating a long-term access easement, one that required the remaining residents to pay a small maintenance fee to the county. That money went into a community fund for public land conservation. In the end, I didn't just reclaim my property, I restored a sense of order to a place that had forgotten what community really meant. When I drive past Lake Haven now, I sometimes stop by the edge of the water. The sun hits the lake the same way it always did, but the air feels quieter, freer. Karen's house sits empty. The HOA office sign is gone. All that remains is the sound of wind moving through the trees, indifferent to rules, fines, or titles. People still ask me how it felt standing there that night with the police lights on my fence. I tell them the truth. It felt like balance finally returning to the land. Because in the end, power doesn't come from bylaws, boards, or threats. It comes from knowing where you stand and who really owns the ground beneath their feet.